So last week, a New York based journalist who's originally from St. Augustine reported a stunning story about a failed assassination attempt on Martin Luther King Jr. in 1964. Hamilton Nolan joins us now via video to tell us the story and how he first learned about it. Hamilton, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ann.
It's great to have you back. So last week, you published a story on your Substack, How Things Work, and it's called The Time That Martin Luther King Jr. Was Almost Assassinated in St. Augustine, Florida. It's sort of an offhand way to reference something monumental, but it kind of reflects how you learned about it. Tell us about how you first heard this story.
Yeah, it's a great story. And, I don't want to pose as too much of an investigative reporter on this because the way that I know about this is that my dad, David Nolan, is a local historian in St. Augustine and probably the world's leading expert on the civil rights history of St. Augustine. So I have been hearing stories from my dad my entire life about the time that Martin Luther King was in St. Augustine and all of the crazy events that surrounded that. So one thing that stood out to me when he told me this story was that I had never heard this story before, and also that it seemed like a historic enough story that everyone should know about it. And the story is basically that in 1964, when the civil rights protests were happening in St. Augustine, Martin Luther King came to St. Augustine. There was a lot of violence. Martin Luther King said St. Augustine was one of the most lawless cities he'd ever seen. But during the time that he was in St. Augustine, a leader of the local civil rights protests in St. Augustine was a Black dentist named Dr. Hayling. And Dr. Hayling's office was a meeting place where they had a lot of strategy meetings during those civil rights protests. Martin Luther King hung out there in Dr. Hayling's office a lot, and a lot of the local white racists knew that. And my dad heard this story from a woman named Cat Twine, who was a well-known figure in Lincolnville and St. Augustine. He called her the Rosa Parks of St. Augustine, and she witnessed this incident. And so Dr. King was in Dr. Haling's office, and a man walked in, a white man, and that man was named Buddy Huff. And Buddy Huff was a kind of local character who owned a tourist attraction called the Tragedy in U.S. History Museum, which was actually right down the street from where I grew up. Kind of an unpopular, offbeat, sort of strange little tourist attraction. But Buddy Huff walked into this office where Dr. Hayling and Martin Luther King were standing, and he had a gun in his hands. And he walked up to Martin Luther King and he said to him, "I came here to kill you today, but I can't do it because I can see that you are a God sent man." And then he turned around and walked out of the office and did not kill Martin Luther King that day. But, one of the many mind blowing things to me about this story is that if he had, in fact, pulled that trigger, the entire course of 20th century U.S. history could have potentially been different. I mean, this was 1964, years before King was eventually assassinated. St. Augustine and the Tragedy in U.S. History Museum could have been as famous as Memphis and the Lorraine Motel and all of the things that actually ended up happening to King. So it was such a mind-blowing story and very little known story, a story that my dad knows and maybe a handful of other people know, but I think is really not widely known in America or even in St. Augustine. And I think that it should be.
It's interesting because obviously, your dad is, as you say, the foremost authority on civil rights history in St. Augustine. And it's been on his shoulders in large part that story has been told at all. There's a lot of people that credit him with bringing to life histories, people, events that happened in St. Augustine that the city had done its best to elide or brush over, in large part because it was a pretty ugly chapter in city history, and in no small part because a lot of the people that were involved on the wrong side of history were still around.
That's right. And that's another thing I've been hearing about my whole life. My dad moved to St. Augustine late 70s, I guess. And so he's been researching this stuff for essentially the whole time he's been in St. Augustine and spent many, many years and decades trying to get the city to promote this side of its history. But it was very true that the same people who were standing at the plaza in downtown St. Augustine beating up the civil rights protesters didn't leave town after the Civil Rights Act passed. Those people were there. And in many cases, they were kind of the good old boys who were very much woven into like the power structure of the city of St. Augustine. And so definitely one of the reasons why St. Augustine for many, many years did not promote its civil rights history is that the sort of villains of civil rights history in St. Augustine were still around. And it was a very long struggle, I think, by my dad and many others in St. Augustine to try to get the city to recognize that part of its history, which it has done to at least to a large degree now. There's a Freedom Trail, there's statues, there's historic markers. So you can go to St. Augustine now and see that civil rights history that a lot of which was uncovered by my dad and other activists in St. Augustine. But yeah, it was not an easy road to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, and worth saying that as recently as the late '90s, that those markers that mark all of these really significant spots in civil rights history weren't there. Um,
Yeah.
if you're just joining us, I'm talking to journalist and author Hamilton Nolan about his recent story about a previously unreported murder attempt on Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine. If you have any comments or questions, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937, or you can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also reach out on social media on Instagram, Facebook, or X at FCC On Air. So, Hamilton, I just want to touch a little bit on the tragedy in U.S. History Museum, because that is, you mentioned Buddy Huff. He was the owner of this strange um, institution that was right near the Fountain of Youth, and it was there for a number of years, and it had a very strange collection of items, including, allegedly the car that Jane Mansfield died in, and I think I personally sat in the the ambulance that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly
Right.
went to the hospital in. But one of the things in this kind of strange collection was a really remarkable set of papers that belonged to a pretty virulent racist in St. Augustine.
Yeah, that man's name was Haas Manusi, and he was kind of the leader of the white racist resistance to the civil rights protests in the 60s. And, the tragedy in U.S. History Museum of people who did not have the good fortune to go there was sort of not one of the top tier tourist attractions in St. Augustine. It was kind of the thing that is now featured in like weird roadside attractions type books and stuff like that. As you said, it was very hard to tell what was actually authentic in the museum. There was a wax figure of Lee Harvey Oswald in the front window. There was allegedly Jane Mansfield's death car. There was allegedly Bonnie and Clyde's death car. I think there were a lot of items associated with Lee Harvey Oswald. There was some medieval torture equipment in the backyard. So kind of a strange little museum that this guy had just assembled himself in his house, basically. But he did, in fact, get Haas Manusi's papers when Haas Manusi died. And my dad, for obvious reasons, had a lot of interest in those papers because they were pretty key to the other side of the civil rights struggle in St. Augustine. And I think that he tried to obtain those papers from Buddy Huff unsuccessfully.
We've got a call from Mark in St. Augustine. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
This is fascinating. I've never heard this story before, and I'm just kind of curious. Has it ever been? Did Martin Luther King ever speak about it publicly? Is it in the historical record somewhere that you could look it up, or is this just? I mean, yeah, this could be totally made up by this Buddy Huff guy or your dad, for that matter of fact. I mean, has this ever been mentioned? Was it reported? Did the police get involved? Anything like that?
Thanks for the call, Mark. I mean, a couple of things we should say, that there were other known attempts on his life in St. Augustine, including the famous picture that we were just showing for those watching our live stream of the bullet hole that was in the building that he was staying at the time. Um, and your father's a fairly unimpeachable source when it comes to local civil rights history. But, to his point,
Yes.
there's not really a record of this as far as we know.
Right. Now, my dad had two sources on this story, like a good journalist. He had Cat Twine, who, again, was a very well-known activist in St. Augustine and who witnessed the event. And he also told this story on some tours that he would give of the Lincolnville neighborhood. And one year when he told this story, after the tour, an elderly white woman came up to him and said to him, I was Buddy Huff's nurse at the end of his life, and Buddy Huff told me the same story. And so it's at least a double source story with an eyewitness, which is pretty good. And I think that, my impression is that, as you said, my dad kind of filed this story along with all the other violent attempts on Martin Luther King that happened while he was in St. Augustine. I think my dad kind of see it as part and parcel of, a series of violent acts against Martin Luther King. But it jumped out at me just because of how close this man actually came to changing history that day.
Yeah. And, speaking to the violence that existed at that time, I mean, you mentioned Hasmanusi, he ran a club that was, I perhaps euphemistically called the Ancient City Hunting Club, which claimed 1,500 members. And this was a time when the membership of that club was essentially deputized by the sheriff, A.L. Davis, during protests. And so these were essentially, um, you know, uh, avowed racists who were given law enforcement powers to enforce during protests, during which they were openly and kind of wantonly attacking young Black protesters.
Right, essentially an army of racist thugs with guns, who were on the same side as law enforcement at that time. I mean, think about what it means for Martin Luther King in 1964 to say, "This is the most lawless town that I've been to." This is Martin Luther King speaking in 1964. He's seen a lot of lawlessness, and St. Augustine was at the top of his list. Protesters were beat up at the beach. They tried to integrate a swimming pool downtown, and the owner famously tried to dump acid into the pool while the protesters were in there. So St. Augustine was famous for being violent and racist and lawless, and that is, again, a side of its history that the town doesn't like to talk about so much, but it's a fact.
Well, Hamilton Nolan, it's an extraordinary story. I'm glad that you've got it on the record. You can find a link to his story on our website and also on Hamilton Nolan's Substack. It's called How Things Work. Hamilton, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me in.